To the extent that we live our lives in a manner that is consistent with the truth in our heart, we thrive.
Welcome to the Meier Clinics podcast, and you just heard a quote from one of your hosts, Dr. Lisa Day. Join our licensed clinical professionals from various backgrounds as they discuss fascinating mental health topics with a wide range of guests. Meier Clinics is a Christian counseling organization with multiple clinics nationwide dedicated to treating the whole person, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Welcome to our listening family. We thank you for joining us. Hey everyone, this is Kristin Sunanta Walker, host of Mental Health News Radio, and I'm here with our program director, Melanie Van. Hey, Melanie.
Hey, Kristin. How are you?
And of course, this is our roundtable discussions with Dr. Paul Meier. Paul, thank you so much for coming back on.
Thank you, Kristin. Hi, Melanie.
Hey, Paul. How are you doing?
Great.
All right. So tonight we're going to talk about helplessness, and then also another definition that's out there that's widely read is learned helplessness, what that means, how you can fall into that trap, and how you can get out of it. So let's start with you, Paul, in terms of your work with people when you see them in that helplessness mode.
I see some people who don't want to be helpless. They'd like to be independent and think for themselves and be self-supporting and things, but they keep failing at it because they, for a variety of reasons, but mostly because they haven't had an opportunity to learn it or be forced to do it. And so there's some people who don't want to be that way who are. There's some people who want to be that way because they love being dependent on others. Mm-hmm. And the more, we've talked about different personality types on our program before, like, perfectionists. Mm-hmm. We did a whole program or more than one. I think we did a couple of them on that. Perfectionists are usually very independent. And in fact, a perfectionist, if he falls in a 8-foot deep ditch and somebody comes walking by, he'll hide because he doesn't want anybody to know he's there because he wants to figure his own way out. But if a helpless person falls into a 3-foot ditch, he'll lay there crying until somebody pulls him up,
right?
Or her. And so some people like being helpless. The more emotional a person is, there's what we call in psychiatry a histrionic personality. That's the person that's real emotional, they're dependent, they're attention seeking, they're seductive. So we used to call it hysterical personality. I think Aristotle called it that 2,500 years ago because he thought they had, he thought women who had a wandering uterus. They used to think that they had a wandering uterus, so they call it like the hysterectomy,
right.
Hysteria.
There's a movie with Maggie Gyllenhaal about that. It was actually
oh, really?
Yeah, it was a good movie.
So people who are real histrionic, a lot of movie stars are real histrionic.
Yes.
People who are real histrionic tend to be more dependent, and they feign to be, they want to be helpless because they want to be taken care of. And then you mentioned learned helplessness. I'm not sure what you mean by that, Kristin, so why don't you define that?
Well, sure. Learned helplessness is, let's say you have a parent who has been helpless, and so you learned how to be that way. Or there's a study, and I'm Googling it right now. I should have had it up. But there's a study that was done, and this is awful. Well, I'll read what Wikipedia says first. Learned helplessness occurs when people or animals feel helpless to avoid negative situations. A person by the name of Martin Seligman first learned helplessness when he was doing experiments on dogs. He noticed that the dogs didn't try to escape shocks in a cage if they had been conditioned to believe they couldn't escape. So
yeah. I heard of that.
Yeah, so it's this, if you're constant, like we hear about this mother and father in California that are in jail right now because they're one of the, what is it, Melanie, 7 people, not just children, but was it 7 or 13
13 kids, I
Yes,
think,
13 kids.
13.
are
They're,
locked up.
yeah.
From age 2 to 29, they actually weren't all children, but because they were so emaciated, they thought they were all children, but it was
They
ages 2
thought
to
they couldn't get out.
29.
Yeah, and they thought they couldn't get out, so they didn't try, and until the one teenager. So when I think about things like that, I think in the history of my family, there's always this one person in each generation. It's always been a female that is deemed the crazy one. They're usually the scapegoated child in the family, and they're the crazy one. They're the ones that scream and yell and cause problems for everybody because they just won't shut up. And that's the kid that makes it out of our generational abuse and actually goes out and has a somewhat or at least more successful, happy existence and doesn't repeat the pattern of abuse.
Yeah, kids.
They didn't keep that learned helplessness going.
Yeah, kids that rebel actually turn out healthier than kids that are totally. As psychiatrists, we worry about the kids that are totally compliant their whole lives. They get straight A's. They never break a rule.
Oh,
they're more likely to commit suicide than the kids who rebel. When they're growing up, because when they rebel, they're individuating and become individuals. And when you remind me what learned helplessness was, I remember hearing that if you take and some kids have done this, if you take a big jar and put dirt and leaves and things in the bottom of it and get a bunch of grasshoppers, and if you put them in the jar, they'll jump back out of the jar. But if you put them in the jar, put a lid on it, punch holes in it so they can breathe, and put some water in there and give them food, they'll try to jump out, but they'll hit their heads on the jar lid, and they'll try that for a day or two. But after a few days, you can take the lid off, and they'll spend the rest of their lives in there because they don't know that they could still jump out.
right.
So they've learned helplessness. And the Apostle Paul said, and I think it's Philippians 4:13, I'm pretty sure, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So biblically, for those of you in our listening family who believe the Bible like I do, and I love you whether you do or don't, but biblically, there's no such thing as can't. And one thing that my brother did that really helped me, I've got an older brother, he passed away a couple of years ago, but I've got an older brother who's 8 years older than me, and he was real nice to me and got me my first basketball and taught me different things. But anytime I used the word can't, he'd punch me on the shoulder 10 times. Anytime, it doesn't matter what the conversation was. If he heard me use the word can't, he'd say, that's the worst 4-letter word that you can use.
Yeah.
So don't cuss. That's the worst cuss word you can say is can't. There's nothing that you can't do, especially if God wants you to do it. And of course, there's things I can't jump over the moon or something, there's,
Right.
The absurd, but okay. That's what I wanted to say.
Melanie, what do you think, Mel?
Well, I think one thing that just immediately came to my mind was kind of, is third world countries that are stuck in the poverty that just sticks around in these countries where no matter what they do, no matter how hard they try, they just don't have the motivation to make things different. And a lot of times that can be learned helplessness. It can be, they don't have the resources. But then another situation that immediately comes to mind is just, a child that grows up in a dysfunctional home. As a child, you really don't have any freedom to be able to remove yourself from a really bad situation in the home if mom and dad are fighting, or if you're being abused or anything like that as a child, then you really don't have any way to get out of it. And unless you're lucky enough for a family member or someone to step in and help you. So you just learn to live in the pain. You feel like you have no control over what's going on. And it's just like that grasshopper. You learn to live in the constant stress of what you're in. And I think learned helplessness is a powerful mind alteration in people's minds. It can lead to depression and anxiety, all sorts of other mental health issues, so that you just don't have the confidence in yourself to move out and past. So you just basically let life happen to you. Mm-hmm. So if you know someone in your life that they just let life happen to them and they don't go out and make life happen, that person may be dealing with some learned helplessness in their own lives, for sure.
I'm going I'm going to say something here, and I'm going to be real careful not to be too politically incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
But the people that are on welfare right now, okay, and I'm not derogatory or complimentary or anything. I'm not, being critical of anybody. There's an old saying, if somebody's hungry, do you bring them fish every day so they won't be hungry, or do you bring them fish and give them a fishing pole and teach them how to fish?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the healthy thing to do is to lovingly make sure they're not starving to death. You love people and want to help them, but you're really being unkind if you get people dependent on the government and they get learned helplessness support, government support.
Right.
Some of them need to do that temporarily until they get on their feet, or they're going through a crisis, or they went through a bankruptcy or something. But there's some people that learn that as a lifestyle. And if we keep giving people handouts, then without teaching them skills, then we're not really being kind to that person. We're teaching them helplessness. And there was a huge poll done on like 300,000 people. I'm trying to remember the name. It's one of the national polls that used to be real big, but I forgot the name of it. Oh, well, if I think of it, I'll tell you what poll it was. But there's a big polling group that used to be the number one polling group about 15 years ago, and then they quit doing as much polls on politics. But they did a poll of several 100,000 people, and for some reason they did it here in the United States and also in China. And they polled people to see what made them happy and what made them depressed. And they found out that 75 that people that are independent and not dependent, people that believe I can somehow, if they're broke, they go get an extra job. If they're lonely, they call somebody up.
Right.
If they have a need, they figure out a way to get it taken care of. People that are independent, 75% are consistently happy, and 25% will have some depression off and on. And people who are helpless and dependent and feel like they can't and depend on others, if they're lonely, it's somebody else's fault that they're lonely. Somebody from the church isn't calling them up to take care of them. If they're broke, it's because there's people out there earning a lot of money and there's income inequality.
Right.
Because some people are working hard and earning a good income and they're not sharing it with me, even though I don't work, I ought to get half, So people that are dependent, 75% are depressed and 25% make it okay. So helplessness is, it causes depression. It's really a severe thing.
Oh, there's something about,
Gallup poll. That's what did it. Gallup.
There it is. Gallup. Yep.
There's something about stretching those muscles, just like, did I want to go on a walk with Melanie today where I've done no exercise all through the holidays? No, I did not, but I did. And I was like, maybe she'll forget and I can take a nap. But we took a walk anyway. We went up a few hills and I was like, because I know that I've done this and I was training for a triathlon and all this stuff. Yeah, I know that it's only going to take a couple walks before I'm like, let's go for a walk. But when you stay in that mode, you just keep staying there. And it's that fight in you that wants to get you out of where you're at. And I think for me, coming from a family of learned helplessness, that's a hard default that I know what that feels like. I know what it looks like. I just, and I have to fight against that. And my fight, I think sometimes the reason why I became an entrepreneur was because I need to be teeter-tottering on an edge of excitement about things in order to combat fiercely the ingrained helplessness that is part of my family's culture.
I didn't know that about you because you seem so independent.
I am.
Since I've known you, you're extremely independent.
I am.
You used to be helpless when you were young?
No, see, that's the thing. I never was. Oh God, no. I came out.
Oh, your family was.
I came out feet first, Paul, literally.
Oh, okay.
But I watched it, and I watched this sort of general malaise and just abuse is happening all around, and no one's doing anything or saying anything, and they're all upset at me. I became that crazy scapegoat in the family that goes throughout the generations. But I see, just rampant codependency, the need in, my elders to find their identity through their mate, and then being angry when their mate doesn't measure up, because no one's ever going to measure up, because you have to find it within you. And I've had parents, my own parents think that I'm supposed to fulfill a partnership role for them, and me making parent decisions even when I was a young kid. And then the guilt and the angry with me when I don't comply, because I'm constantly trying to individuate. I feel the suck of neediness. And I want you to just be here for me, be here for me, because I'm really strong. And then their anger at me when I say no, because I will say no. And even though I am very strong, I have a heart. And so when a parent gets upset with me, it hurts. It hurts like no pain ever. It's almost as bad as if my son is upset. And, the guilt and all those things. But my fierce independence was out of the contrast of seeing family members absolutely have no idea who they are and not stretch those muscles to make themselves have their own identity. So I would.
So you decided at a young age.
Oh yeah.
Probably what, 2, 3, 4 years old, or
probably what? When I first started getting in trouble. Yes.
People can change with therapy, and with marriage can help change somebody. And that, we learned in residency, there's 3 things that can change a man dramatically: falling in love with a woman, therapy, and God.
Right.
And but I think that most helplessness that people have in life today was probably there by their 6th birthday. I think some parents are so controlling that they want to think for the child. They want the child to be dependent on them. It makes them feel powerful.
Yes.
And if a child thinks for himself, that upsets the parent. It makes them angry, because they want to be they want to be in control. I've got a patient, without mentioning any names or anything. I've got a patient who is a young adult. I'll say she. I'm not letting anybody know if it's a guy or a gal, but I'll say she, because I don't want whoever it is to recognize who I'm talking about. But that person's mother comes with that person for all his meetings with me. And whenever I ask that person a question, the mother answers. Mm-hmm. And I finally last week said, politely, I said, would you mind not answering for so-and-so? I really want to learn what, so-and-so, how really so-and-so feels about that. Yeah. What symptoms that person's having. A lot of times it's learned.
I'll say this, and then Melanie, I want to pass it to you. I learned this when I was doing, when I was actively with my therapy dog, and we went to hospitals and we were on psych wards and in behavioral health places, but that I didn't learn anything too much about learned helplessness there. I wasn't paying attention to that, but I saw this, and in no way am I saying that stuttering is learned helplessness at all. But here's an interesting thing that reminds me of what we're talking about. I would take Miles to the library with me, and kids that had some kind of speech impediment would come in, or a reading issue. They would come in and read to him. And it was fascinating, because some of the parents would not, but there was so much pressure in the room that I can feel, Miles can feel, and obviously their child is feeling about this child not being able to read or having a stutter or whatever. And I just got to the point where they would say, they actually complained. A couple of the parents complained to the library and said, she is such a bitch. Look at her. She's kicking us out of the room. But their kids actually read, and they ended up calling back and saying, thank you, she was great, blah, blah, blah. And I didn't care either way. But I would get to a point where I would say, you know what? When you leave, let's record your child reading, because it takes about 10 minutes to get them calmed down from your presence in the room. But when you leave and it's just me sitting behind the child so that they can't see me, and Miles in front of them while they read, magically, either it disappears, their problems disappear, or they're severely lessened every single time. But when the parents are there, what I notice with a lot of kids is they'd look to mom or look to dad or look to siblings to help them. And I'd go, don't look at them. You need to do this. So, Melanie, what do you think about that? Or whatever you want to say.
Well, I've definitely seen that kind of dynamic work out too, Kristin, with parents and Paul too. Paul, I've definitely had, I've definitely eventually just had to ask parents to leave sessions with their kids so that the child would have a chance to express themselves. And I have definitely had that kind of, narcissistic or histrionic parent or mother that just every time you ask a question, the mother, answers, and the child is just sitting there kind of limp on the couch. And that is kind of a view of what learned helplessness must feel like, because no matter how much the child might try to individuate, they're never allowed to. So they learn a couple of things. Number one, they don't learn how to make decisions. They learn that they can't trust themselves, and they learn that they have no power. And these are all things that you try to teach your children as you're growing up, because eventually they have to go out into their own world and make their own decisions, and hopefully make wise decisions. So when you're not allowing your children to make decisions, it really is a disservice to them. And the stuttering piece too, Kristin, I've seen that several times. The kids sometimes, they so want to please their parents. So and there's so much pressure, even if it's unintentional by a parent. There's so much pressure for that child to please. Then I would imagine when the parent steps out of the room, it's definitely easy for them to be able to read more clearly. But and
sometimes it is neurological too.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
I don't want people to feel guilty, if they have that problem.
I think most of the time it is neurological. But
relaxing can make it better.
Exactly.
Like they can sing. People who stutter can sing without stuttering.
Yeah, Bruce Willis, actually, the famous Bruce Willis with all the Die Hard. Bruce Willis of all, exactly. He was a big time stutterer, and he got into acting because on stage he didn't have a stutter when he was doing a performance. So
there's a singer too. I don't know if it was Mel Tillis or somebody else that stuttered all the time when he talked, but he could sing without stuttering, and it was really neat.
It was really cool because we did a show with a therapist who treats people who have a stutter, and she stutters. And we just did the show as is. And I told my editor, don't speed anything up. Don't fix anything. I want this to be heard exactly as is, because there's enough stigma about this out there. Let's just hear exactly how someone talks and how they learn to, it's again, building that muscle of, okay, this is something that I have that is part of me. It makes society uncomfortable often, but I'm going to show my ways of coping and dealing with this. I don't even want to call it a problem, because we're the ones that call it a problem, with the way that they talk that's different from ours. And let's show what that really looks like and feels like. And let's watch a seasoned professional that treats this navigate her way through a conversation successfully with a few hiccups here and there. I just thought it was important to just lay it out like that. And we still get downloads on that show and emails about it.
Interesting. I agree with Paul that I do think learned helplessness probably is learned before your 6th birthday, maybe even before your 3rd birthday. But then I do think there's probably situations like, I think learned helplessness has a huge part in why people stay with abusive partners. Yes. Because I think, you stay in those relationships because you keep trying, and no matter what, it doesn't make a difference. So then you just have no desire to fight and to try to get out of the relationship. But just to speak a little bit to what Paul was talking about subsidizing and things like that, or just poverty in general. I've worked, I wouldn't say frequently, but I have worked some in low income situations. And I used to actually make visits into the projects here in Richmond, Virginia. And I'll tell you, it was either two ways. There were either the parents that knew they weren't going to be there forever, and they were fighting and trying to make a better life for their children. And then there were those parents and families that had no desire to get out whatsoever, and that was just where they were going to be. They were thankful for it. and they just had no desire to move forward past anything.
Hi, this is Dr. Paul Meier of the Meier Clinics. Our Christian counselors across the country have a goal of helping all those who come to us to become what God has called them to be. If you're in a situation where you're not at peace within yourself, or you just feel like there's joy that's missing in your life, we can come alongside to help you obtain peace and joy.
This message is sponsored by the Meier Clinic Foundation, a nonprofit Christian counseling ministry. The number is 1-888-7-CLINIC, 1-888-7-CLINIC.
And then you had the other folks that this was totally temporary for them, and you knew that it was temporary. And then the other thing too, which I love this dynamic, when I used to volunteer for Crossover Clinic in downtown Richmond, they had a policy where it was a free clinic, but if you could pay, you were asked to pay what you could. Mm-hmm. And every single time when patients would come in and pay, they were more adherent to their visits. They would show up more often. They would take their medicines more often. And it gave them some pride. So instead of taking their pride and just seeing them for free, I mean, I would stand in the back office sometimes. I wouldn't have clients, and I would just stand up and greet people. And those people that would come up with $2, and that was all they had to pay for their visit, they just seemed so proud to be paying something. And those seem to be the patients that would be able to, stick to a treatment plan and move forward. So there is some psychological something that goes on there. I'm not quite sure where it is. If we could figure that out, the world would probably change. But I did just want to, speak to that. Or even in a situation like if a child has a learning disability or stuttering or ADHD or dyslexia, and you try so hard, even harder than other children do, but yet you still don't do as well, I think a child would probably get to a point where they just stop trying. Well, I can't do anything right, so why should I still can't do it. I studied all night and I still only got a D, and this person doesn't, and so they just give up. So there's many avenues, I think, to learned helplessness, but again, it's powerful, and then it doesn't give you the will to fight. And when you don't have that fighting spirit, then what do you even really have to look forward to? And then you lose hope. And when you lose hope, then that's when really, I think, things just start to take a turn south, and things can just get really dark for people.
I used to be active when I lived in California for 4 years, and I was on the plans and stuff, and I also did that in Dallas for a couple of years. Worked with the homeless association that is in charge, of reaching out to those people who are homeless. And in both cities, they said, when people are out on the corner begging, don't give them any money. It's better not to give them. People go out there and make $50,000 a year and they use it for drugs and things like that. If people are homeless, they can go to, whatever city they're in, they can go to the homeless association, and they'll help them. They'll help them find food. They'll help them find a job. They'll help them get free medications and things like that. So it's better, if you want to give money to help the homeless, give it to your local homeless association, and don't give it to beggars on the street. Now that's just my opinion. I'm going to get some nasty emails for that one probably.
Well, we have all kinds of opinions on the show, and and from our audience. And I think that there's a degree. I think that sometimes, there's someone who is homeless and you're giving them, something that helps them, restores their faith in humanity, and then they can pull themselves out of where they're at. And then there's situations, like you said, Paul, where there's someone in any situation where they've just keep getting given to, and they don't ever learn to build those tools to have that grit that we all have to just make it through this very difficult thing called life. And if you, it speaks to me about how destructive being an enabler is. And when you're looking at, I want to delve into what it looks like to be someone who has been raised amongst very controlling people who try to create learned helplessness because that's how they try to get love. And then also what it's like to be someone who is very strong and has people that have that learned helplessness coming in every so often and trying to get them to take care of them. So because it's an interesting dynamic either way. So let's start with the one where, what does it look like to have a parent or a husband or a wife or whatever the scenario may be? Maybe it's a parent with an adult child, and the parent is still trying to create or foster extreme neediness, whether it be financial, whatever it is, with their adult child in order to stay in control of them, or a mate or whatever. What does that look like, Melanie?
I'm going to talk about homelessness for 1 second, and then I'm going to address that, because I think the control piece a lot of times is a huge part of learned helplessness, and how it gets started in families. But I feel like one thing you can always do for someone that's homeless is literally just make eye contact.
Yes.
And speak. And if you have the time, sit down and talk to them for a few minutes. And I used to do that when I was at NC State a lot. I would look people in the eye and shake their hand, or just sit down and talk with them for a while. And I feel like they appreciate it. Humanizes them again. I never had money to give them as a college student, for sure. But I feel like that's one way you can make a difference in their life, and maybe even encourage them to go get help. But I know looking people in the eyes sometimes is all they need to be reminded that they may be in this horrible spot. And I think most people that are homeless have mental health problems that are not being addressed.
A lot of them do.
Period. Yeah. So I think that's
25% are schizophrenic.
Yes. Exactly. So that's a big piece of it. So I just wanted to speak to that. But control
the majority are addicted too.
Yeah.
Yes, I think a lot of them are addicts, but I think a lot of times they're just self-medicating. So that's homelessness is a complicated situation for sure, but there are lots of good programs out there. But Kristin, what you were speaking of, and that is, a parent trying to control an adult child and still trying to foster that learned helplessness relationship within. When a parent treats a child so that the child has learned helplessness, then the child, like we were saying, never individuates. And that brings the parent safety, because the parent probably doesn't have enough of their own personality or enough of their own strength to make it through life on their own. So the child is an appendage of the parent. And as long as the parent has financial control, emotional control, maybe they don't allow the child or adult child to even move out of the house without feeling incredibly guilty, then really it disables the adult child from ever being able to move out of the house and move on with their own lives. It can be detrimental, because this seeps over into every area of your life. It's the self-confidence that's never built. It's like if you always tie your child's shoe, they're never going to learn how to tie their own shoe. If you're always doing things for your kids, then they never learn how to do those things on their own. And that's what builds self-efficacy. And that is so important to individuating and being able to live and create in their own lives. So that need for control is obviously just a sign of pathology within the parent. And I mean, my advice to maybe an adult child that's in that situation is just start doing little things in your life to start building your own confidence within yourself. If you're constantly correcting a child's paper before they turn it in at school, then they're going to get to college and they're not going to write a good paper. And
some parents do it all for them.
Oh,
so exactly. Exactly.
Do their homework for them.
Yeah, if you're standing over their back constantly and checking every single helicopter parenting is that whole concept of if you're checking everything behind them, then they're not learning to trust themselves. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it does.
When we're treating a dependent client, they'll say something like, Dr. Meier, what should I do about this? And the worst thing I can do, and I may have a really good idea that would help them, But the worst thing I can do is tell them what that idea is. Instead, what I would do is say, well, what are your options? Well, I want you to tell me. I said, no, I want you to think of some options. Let's talk about it. What are some things that you could do? What's your plan? Well, I don't have a plan. Well, think of several of them. There's probably 50 of them that would work. I tell them if you ask Jesus if there's a solution, I'm sure he could think of a million of them. But so what are some things you could do? And they'll start thinking of a few things, and I've got this best answer in the back of my mind, that I think would work the best. But I'll keep asking them, and then when they come up, and maybe give them a few little hints, and when they come up with what I think would be best, or even something else that's totally not what I thought would be best, but sounds good, I'll say that sounds like a really good plan that you came up with, and I'll say you came up with that plan, and then I'll say, so why don't you try your plan this week that you came up with, and next week when you come back, we'll discuss what happened. And so they may try it and fail because they're so used to failing that they set themselves up for it, and they'll come back and say it didn't work. They'll say, Dr. Meier, your plan didn't work. I'll say, no, wait, it wasn't my plan. It was your plan. And they'll say it didn't work. I say, well, that's okay. You learn from failure. Failure is good for you. So if plan A didn't work, so what's plan B? Let's come up with another plan. And then if they call you on the phone and for an emergency call, and they say, Dr. Meier, blah, 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 blah. I'll say, well, what do you think you ought to do about it? And I'll make them think. And at least I used to do this when I did therapy all the time. Now I just do meds most of the time. But and so after a while, they'd come to their session and they'll say, I almost called you this week because I had an emergency, but I knew you'd just make me decide for myself what to do. So I just figured it out on my own.
Yeah.
I think as far as parents that are controlling, a lot of them are real narcissistic.
Yes.
And not all of them, but some parents are real narcissistic, and it gives them a feeling of power to be totally in control of a child, and they have that child, be totally dependent on them. And then some are paranoid. Paranoid people want to be in control of every little detail. If they run an organization, they have to control, where the janitor puts the chairs. They have to control everything. And then some are perfectionists. Some are just extreme perfectionistic parents who mean well, but they want everything to be perfect. And so they make sure everything their child does at school is perfect, and they help them too much. So I think there's different kinds of parents that can be overly controlling, but I think most of them are narcissistic.
Yeah, I think too, we can slip a different title in there too. It could be your spouse is that way, and your spouse is acting like a parent, and not really your equal, your mate. That can be that too. And, I've seen the other side of this, and I've experienced this because I have always been so independent, and I have been the breadwinner, and I take care of other people financially, in some ways. And I have in the past had people sort of latch on to me. And after a while in the relationship, I realized, oh my God, they're angling to be my dependent. Mm-hmm. And it's either, it could be a friend of mine, or it can be a love interest, and I realized that's what they're angling for. And instead of I did get angry, and I said to the last one, I'm not responsible for you and your child. I'm not looking for another set of dependents. You need to go and, you've never not lived with your parents. You need to go have that. I have many, many years not lived with my parents. You never have. You need to go, stretch those muscles. It's scary. And if you have to work at Burger King to make that happen, do it. There's no shame in it. Whatever work you can get, it's a disservice that you haven't been allowed to do that, and that you haven't done that for yourself. But I said, no, this is not going to happen. And I thought later, good for me. And also, I need to get into therapy, because why did I even let it go that far? There was some sort of me being codependent and wanting to help them that I needed to look at and clean up and shore up in myself. I didn't just blame it on them. I looked at, well, what the heck did I do to attract that, and let it go on as long as it did.
Yeah. In a marriage, one way you can tell who's the most controlling is whoever uses the words you should or you shouldn't the most. Well, you should do this, you should do that, or you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. That's being a parent to the mate instead of being a mate to the mate. You're acting like a parent if you say you should or you shouldn't. And it's healthier to say, here's how I feel when you do that. Now, whether you do that or not is your business, but I feel sad or I feel angry or I feel happy or whatever. I feel this way when you do that. And that way you're giving the other person the freedom to decide whether to change or not. And they're a lot more likely to change. If you tell somebody, if my wife told me I should or shouldn't do something, I'm going to almost automatically argue,
Same
just because
here.
it irritates me to have anybody tell me you should do this, you shouldn't do that, because that implies I'm doing something wrong, even if they're totally right. But if my wife says, here's how I feel when you come home late, you don't call me first, let me know because I've got dinner ready or something, then that makes me really want to be responsible about that in the future and not make the same mistake again. So that's one. Also, when I'm doing therapy with people, if somebody uses the word, anytime they use the word I can't, then like my brother did, I won't let them. I don't beat them on the shoulder 10 times like my brother did with me, but
Lawsuit.
I asked them to change that. I say, will you change that sentence to either I will or I won't? If they say, well, I just can't get along with my mate, or I can't discipline my child. I just can't get myself to discipline my child. Then I say, and I'm not trying to lay a guilt trip on you. I say, just either say, tell me right now, I won't discipline my child, or I will discipline my child, because there's no such thing as can't.
Right.
And it helps them to see the truth. And then when people use the words I'll try, they usually mean I'll make a half-hearted effort, but I won't quite succeed. So if they use the words I'll try, I ask them again, change it to either I will or I won't. And I don't care which one you pick. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty or whatever. Just either say I will or I won't, but don't say I can't, and don't say I'll try.
Right.
Those are lies.
Right. Melanie, what are your thoughts?
I like the I can't piece.
Mm-hmm.
I think for a clinician, that would be an indication that you might be dealing with someone that may have learned helplessness. And I know we're getting close to close, but I think about what would be ways, if you think you suffer from learned helplessness, what would be ways that you could try to step out of that? And what I was going to just do small things. Do small things to start building your self-confidence, because everyone has the capacity to help themselves. And the reality is, a lot of times you're the only person that's going to do that in your life.
Right.
So, and this would be a whole other topic, but I honestly think that sometimes as Christians, we can kind of create this learned helplessness with God, where we just sit back and say, well, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to let God take care of it.
Yeah.
And yes, that's true to an extent, but we don't just sit around and not try to get a job because we think God's going to pay our rent the next month. I mean, there has to be some type of moving forward, so that we can continue on in our lives. So I feel like that would be a whole nother discussion for us. But
yeah. Hey, Melanie.
Yeah.
Melanie, at the beginning of our talk, I mentioned a verse the Apostle Paul said in Philippians 4:13, and it doesn't say God will do everything for me. It says I can do all things.
Very good
through
point.
Christ who strengthens me. So God's job isn't to do things for us, although sometimes I know he does.
Yeah.
His job is to help us do things for ourselves.
Yes, agreed. And everyone has that capacity. So, and sometimes you just have to, if you know that someone has kind of pushed you into learned helplessness, like a parent or a mate or even a sibling or someone at work, sometimes you just have to get yourself out of those. You have to get yourself out of those relationships. So,
or politicians.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And sometimes you just have to make a boundary.
Absolutely. I'd say do that hard thing. I mean, move out, live on your own, get a second job, whatever it is, to prove to yourself that you can do it. And it's scary it is so scary. And you don't feel safe in the world because you've been coddled into this unreal existence, a very fearful existence, because that's where this person lives, is fear. That's why they're trying to control you. And the only way for you to break out of that is do those things that you are fearful of, and go be around a lot of other people that live their own lives. Hang with them, dip into their lives and see, oh, that's what they can do. So you've got lots of examples around you of people that are not helpless. And that will start to charge you up and make you realize, okay, I can do these things. They do it, because you're looking for models. And those are great ways to stretch your wings and get out of a state of either your own learned helplessness or someone that's trying to make you become that out of their own need to control and their own fear.
Yeah, it's important to realize too that when you're working really hard at becoming more independent, less helpless in a certain area, if you fail, don't say, "Oh, see, I can't do it."
Thank you.
Learn from the failure. Grow from it. Failure is good for you.
Right.
Failure helps you grow. If you don't give up, then you learn from failure. So just keep working at it and work at more than one in more than one area, and when you fail, learn from it, and the next time you won't. So just if plan A doesn't work, that's fine. Go to plan B.
Exactly. All right. Well, this was great. Thank you both for coming on and talking about this subject. Another last minute pick. So thank you.
Thank you, guys. It was a good one.
Yeah.
Yep.
And thanks to our listeners for another edition of Mental Health News Radio.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. Tune in next time for another engaging discussion on relevant mental health topics. If you have any questions about Meier Clinics, please visit our website at meierclinics.com. That's MEIER clinics.com, or call us at 888-7-CLINIC. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or any of your favorite podcast apps. And please note that we are a member of and produced by Mental Health News Radio Network, MHNRnetwork.com.